Hi everyone, welcome to lecture 6. Today's topic is migration. A very interesting topic, also a very big one that is obviously very closely linked to globalization. The picture that you see here is a statue that is called The Refugee by Bruno Catalano that is located in Marseille in France. That I think represents migration very well. So let's get started. As usual, very quick admin reminder. I'm sure you know it by heart now. The only difference is that you've done your assignment 1. The next assignment 2, is due on the 9th of October, also at midnight. It's a research essay, so it requires quite a bit more work because you are required to research, to do a lot of reading, structuring before you even start writing. Make sure you engage with it early on. All the instructions are already on Learn and on Moodle, so you can already find everything. And we will also do a small activity on essay writing tips after your semester break. So that's for now. As usual, it is your responsibility to manage your time responsibly and to stay up to date with the weekly online lectures and activities. So if you're behind, make sure you catch up over semester break and actually make use of this week to catch up on everything that you're behind on. Okay, so let's get started. About today's session, we're first going to look at migration flows. You know from our first lecture that flows are a very important concept in globalization. So we'll start looking at migration flows and see where these flows come from and where they go. We're going to very quickly look at a brief history of migration because migration is not something new. Sometimes when we read the news, we have the impression that only now people are migrating. But actually migration has been there since the beginning of humankind. Otherwise we wouldn't be spread all over the world. Otherwise we would only have humans on the African continent, right? So that's something to keep in mind. We're also going to look at different types of migrants because usually when we think of migration, we mostly think of refugees and of illegal migrants, but there's many different types of migrants that actually make up a much bigger part of global migration than strictly refugees or illegal migrants. We're obviously going to look at factors for migration. We're going to look at push and pull factors and what those are. And then we're going to specifically look at some key concepts that are very closely linked to migration. One is the concept of diaspora, the concept of remittances and brain drain. And we're also going to look a little bit at integration, which is sort of the other side to migration. That is something that every country handles in a very different way, and it has also changed over time. And then we're going to look at 2 case studies. One, we're going to look at migration towards Europe, and the other one, because we're in South Africa, obviously we're going to look at migration to South Africa. And we're going to close looking at the good sides of migration as well, because often the debate around migration is a very negative one, especially in the news. So it's important to keep the other side in mind as well, because there's definitely good sides of migration as well. Okay, so now we're going to start with a few numbers, just to put it into perspective, because as we said, migration is in the news very often, usually with bad news, and it often sounds like everybody's migrating, but actually the numbers are not that big. So here, a very small quiz you can ask yourself before I give you the solution. In 2017, how many percentages of the world's population do you think were migrants? It was 3.4%, which is approximately 258 million people. The regions attracting the largest numbers of migrants are, which ones do you think? Number 1 is Europe, attracting 72 million people. Number 2 is Asia, attracting 71 million. We will look at those flows a bit more in detail in the next slide, because there's a lot of migration within the same continent as well. The country with the largest migrant population is, this one should be an easy one, the USA, obviously, a country of migrants. That was built by migrants and is still having a lot of migration. How many million of people were refugees in 2008? 25.9 million. So approximately 10% of the overall migrant population were refugees. Refugees are specifically migrants that are migrating because they're escaping either war or famine or other catastrophes, right? South Africa is the 17th biggest receiving country globally, and South Africa mostly receives migrants from the following 3 countries. I wonder if you get them right. Number 1 is Zimbabwe, number 2 Lesotho, number 3 the United Kingdom. So these just some stats to start off, and for you to sort of put the perspective that you might have had about migration into perspective, depending on how far off you were with your guesses. Now, as I said, we can look at this a bit more in detail. This is a really cool website. You have the source here, so you can go check it out because it moves and you can look at things more in detail. These are just screenshots, so they don't provide as much data. But basically, you can see by continent how many millions. This is migration flows 2005 to 2010, so over 5 years, and it's obviously estimates, right? Because there's not all the numbers are completely reliable and available. But basically, you can see that, for example, the African continent had about 3.7 something million that came in, and about 6.5 that went out. But now, if you look at this closer, you will see that half of the people going out actually migrated within the African continent and just migrated to probably neighboring countries. Some of the people who went out migrated to Europe, some of them to West Asia, and then smaller portions to North America and to Oceania, which would be Australia, New Zealand, and other Pacific islands. You can see also, for example, Latin America also had many more going out than going in, a large portion going to North America, also quite a portion going to Europe, and then also part of it migrating within the continent. So it's quite interesting. Or here, for example, you can see that South Asia has a big portion of migrants going to West Asia. In Europe, you see that a lot of the migration is within the continent, so it's from some European countries to other European countries. And you also have continents, obviously, that have much more population coming in than going out. For example, North America, you see that all of these are people coming in, while you have relatively few people going out, most of them going to Europe. On the website, you can also check it out by country. For example, South Africa had an in of 780,000 plus people and an out of quite a bit less. And then you can literally check it out for each country. It's estimates, but it is quite interesting. So yeah, I would recommend that you check out the website. Now, before we start, we have to ask ourselves questions, right? Why? The first question, the most obvious one, is why do people even migrate? What are reasons for people to leave their homes and to move to another place that they don't even know? Another important question is, has migration changed over time? And if yes, what is different now to back in the days? And then the third question we also need to ask ourselves is, do we consider that migration is a good thing or a bad thing? And what are benefits and risks? And what are different aspects to it, apart from what we read in the news, right? So this lecture should hopefully help you answer these questions in a more differentiated way than you probably would right now. Now, if we look at the brief history of migration, and this is like very brief, right? Prior to Westphalia and prior to the birth of the nation state, people moved rather freely, right? So that's something to keep in mind. It's only with the birth of the nation state as a structure and then with colonization and with sort of the export of the nation state as a structure, that borders became much more important because they became part of securing the sovereignty of a territory. And so only since then it started becoming harder for people to move, right? So prior to that, because there were sort of less formal structures, it was much easier for people to move freely. Then fast forward almost 400 years, the 19th century was a high point of international migration, right? So despite the fact that we obviously have nation states in the 19th century, there was a very, very strong migration, particularly from Europe to the US, with about 50 million people moving from Europe to the US. So this is 50 million back in the 19th century, right? So this was a massive amount of people. And what's interesting about that time is that the liberty to move to another nation was actually considered a fundamental individual right that was also stipulated in the International Immigration Conference. Nowadays, the right to freedom of movement is still a human right that is in the Universal Human Rights Charter. It's one of the fundamental rights. But we're seeing a very different sort of treatment or handling of migration and of the liberty to move, right? So back then it was much easier than it is nowadays. And it's with World War I, so in the 20th century, that nation states start to impose more drastic restrictions on people's movement. So it's basically about 100 years that it has been more difficult and that the movement of people is more controlled and more restricted. And something that is also worthy of note is that in general, globalization has rather liberalized or helped the flow of things, right? So trade has, the flow of trade, of finance, of investment has increased massively over the past century. However, the flow of people, not necessarily, right? Like, yes, we're seeing much more movement of people, particularly for business travel, for vacations, for travel. But actually the ease to migrate, to really move to another country is not more than what it was, right? So basically the flow of people is sort of a bit of an exception to the flow of other things in terms of globalization, right? And the reasons are quite obvious. Nations try to keep the labor that they need in their own country, and there's obviously also a big fear of unemployment that might come with massive immigration, of potential conflict. There is a fear of terrorism that has grown a lot past 9/11, and also the crime that is associated with migrants. And obviously also to a certain extent, just the fear of a different culture coming in. So the fear of certain maybe cultural conflicts or cultural diversity coming with migration. So there's a lot of reasons why nations sort of try to keep a hold over their population, and don't want to lose their own population, but also don't want uncontrolled mass immigration from other countries. So this just very briefly to sort of be aware that there have been changes in migration, and it's not always been the way it is nowadays. There are, if we look at sort of the history of migration, there's several trends in migration today that sort of differentiated from migration back in the days. One is that we have a globalization of migration. So the numbers of countries that are affected by migration has expanded and virtually includes the entire world. There's almost no country that doesn't have either immigration or both. So you don't have such clear sort of destination countries. It literally has become something that affects almost every country in the world. We also have an acceleration. So in the past years, migration has been growing in volume every year, particularly forced migration, which is the concerning factor, because forced migrations are migrants that are refugees We have an increasing amount of climate refugees, which are people that are leaving their home country either because of natural catastrophes that are due to climate change or because climate change is in some other way rendering their home countries difficult to live in, right? So this is something that is increasing. Forced migration also due to increased number of conflicts all around the world. We are also seeing a differentiation, which is quite interesting. So we're seeing that there's many different types of migration, and we're going to look at this in just a moment. So it's not just refugees, it's also people who migrate for labor, for professional opportunities, some people for retirement, to reunite with their families. So there's many different types of migration. We're also seeing a trend that we can call feminization. Back in the days, migration used to be very much male dominated. So it would usually be men who migrate to look for work. But today, actually, women even make a majority of migrants in certain categories. So it depends what type of migrant we're looking at. But there's a lot of women who are part of migration. We're also seeing an increasing politicization and mediatization of migration. Migration is increasingly in domestic and in international politics, but it's also increasingly in the media. It's also topics that has been used and that is being used by a lot of political parties to get voters to vote for one thing or the other, right? So it is a topic that has also been used quite a lot because it is very divisive and because it can bring about a lot of fears in people and a lot of conflict, potential conflict at least. So it is something that has been politicized a lot in many countries. And last but not least, we're also seeing changing destinations. So traditional immigration countries are at times becoming targets of immigration or of transition instead. So for example, Europe, that was mainly a region of immigration in the 19th century with millions of people moving to the United States, is now in this century rather a target where people immigrate into. So we're seeing all of these different trends in migration compared to back in the days. Now, when we talk about migration, it's important to keep in mind that there's different types of migrants and they move for different reasons and they also move in different ways, right? So one migrant, which is probably the sort of the traditional migrant that especially back in the days, a lot of people migrate for these reasons, are temporary guest migrants. So these are guest workers and overseas contract workers that move to a country for a limited amount of time, usually with the intention of doing a job there and sending money home, right? The money that they send home is what we call remittances. We're going to look at it a bit later in the lecture. These can be migrants that go for a season. So, for example, harvesting season, particularly in the US, there's a lot of migrants that go in to help with the harvest and then they leave again. So that's literally migrating for a few months. These can also be other migrants that literally just go for a contract, maybe of 1 year, 2 years. But they usually migrate for the job and they have the intention of moving back home. So there's usually the main factor is the job and the opportunity. We have irregular migrants. So these are undocumented migrants. It's what is usually in the news. So these are migrants that either travel without permits, so they travel and cross borders illegally, or otherwise it's migrants that overstay their permits. So they might have a permit as a temporary guest migrant and then they might overstay it. Usually they migrate for economic reasons because the situation in their home countries is just too difficult and they feel they have more chances at a better life in another country. Another type of migrant are forced migrants. As we saw, it's a rather small portion. It's about 10% of migrants. But this is a group that is increasing in numbers, which is obviously worrying because forced migrants are refugees and asylum seekers. So it's really people who are forced to leave their home countries due to fear, due to conflict, due to catastrophe. And because they usually really feel that there is no life possible anymore in their home countries. So these are migrants that often take or have to take great risks in order to migrate, that have to take very difficult and very dangerous journeys, be it over land, be it over water, in order to get to a hopefully better life, right? And then there's a fourth category that we often forget, but that is increasing as well, which is highly skilled migrants. So these are workers with special qualifications who generally migrate for better economic opportunities, right? So they might migrate like temporary guest migrants for just a specific amount of time, for a few years, but they might also migrate for good because there's just better opportunities somewhere else, which often causes brain drain to the home country. We'll see what that is. So these are four types of different migrants. Questions with which one do we hear most about? Usually the forced migrants and the irregular migrants, right? We forget about the other two, even though they actually make up the biggest portion of migrants. So this just to keep in mind as well. Because there's different reasons for migration and also different ways in which these migrants migrate. A highly skilled migrant is going to take a plane, maybe even business class, while a forced migrant is going to be forced to take very dangerous routes, same as an irregular migrant. Some of them will travel illegally, some of them will have all of their papers sorted out by their jobs, right? So there's very different conditions that come with the different types of migration. Now, if we look more specifically at forced migration, these are numbers from 2019, so from last year, from the UN Refugee Agency. In 2019, roughly 70 million people were forcibly displaced people globally, right? And as you can see, more than half of this are internally displaced people. So these are people that are displaced in their own countries, usually due to conflict. You have roughly 26 million people refugees, and then about 3.5 million asylum seekers. And what is maybe interesting, which we sometimes forget, because we hear mostly about certain routes, right? 80% of refugees actually live in the neighboring countries. So they usually really just escape their home country because of conflict, because of catastrophe, and they go into the neighboring country and they stay there, often in refugee camps, hoping to eventually be able to go back, right? Top refugee hosting countries in 2019, Germany, Sudan, Uganda, Pakistan, Turkey. Also probably some surprises there, right? Because it's not necessarily what we hear. Another quite important number, 3.9 million people who are stateless. But there's thought to be many more millions. So these are people who literally don't belong in any country, which obviously 500 years ago would not have been a massive problem, but nowadays, with a world that is structured with nation state, is a massive problem, right? Because our fundamental human rights are usually linked to us being a legal citizen of a country. So as soon as you're an illegal stateless person, you lose, unfortunately, most of your rights, at least in legal terms, right? This is something that has been increasing. We see more forced migration every year due to conflict, due to climate. And it's something that many countries are very aware of and also increasingly worried about. Now, if we look at, we sort of touched on factors for migration already. As we said, there's very different motivations for migration. Usually, the factors are categorized into two categories. One are push factors. So push factors are really motivations or reasons that push the person out of their home country. as the word already says, right? So it's really motivations of the migrant and usually the situation in the home country as well that push the person to leave their home country. So it can be disruptions in the home country that make it difficult or impossible to build a future. So it can be high unemployment, it can be economic depression, low pay, war, famine, political persecution, environmental catastrophe, to name just a few, right? There's many more that can fall into this category. The important thing to remember is that push factors are really factors that push a person out of their home country, or at least make the person feel like there is no future and that they have to leave. The other category of factors is what we call pull factors. So these are factors that attract people into a specific country, right? So the push factors will push me out of my home country, but then I have a lot of options, possibly a lot of options to which country I go to. So pull factors are the factors that will attract me to a specific country. So it can be favorable conditions in the host country. This can be maybe a country has easier immigration policies than another one. Maybe there's lower unemployment or there's labor shortages in the host country. So you will move to that specific country. There might be a higher pay. Your family might already be there. So moving to that country means you can reunite with your family. Another big factor is that there might already be formal or informal networks in the countries that cater to migrants. So, for example, a lot of African migrants from French-speaking African countries will rather move to France because there already are many people from their home country there. So they will arrive there and there will, for example, already be a network of Senegalese people in France. So as a Senegalese, you will arrive there and you'll already have a support structure. And then obviously, this goes also with the example that I just made, a similarity in language and culture, right? Particularly in language. Obviously, if you can migrate to a country that speaks the same language that you already speak, you have a massive advantage. That's why we see that particularly in France or in other French-speaking countries in Europe, you will see a lot of migration from French-speaking African countries. On the African continent, you will see quite a lot of migration towards South Africa, towards Kenya, obviously because of the economies, but also because the language might be the same, right? From Latin America, we see quite a lot of migration to Spain, also because of the language and the similarity in culture. So that can be quite an important factor, right? Now, usually migration is explained with a combination of push and pull factors, right? And you can look at this either on a personal, like really looking at one migrant, what are these migrants' push and pull factors, but you can also look at whole groups of people. What are the push factors that push these people out of their home countries, and what are pull factors of why they come to stay in a new host country? In the case of conflict-related migration, usually the push factor is war or conflict. The pull factor will usually just be that it's the neighboring country, so it's the easiest and shortest route to go to. So any sort of migration situation should always be looked at in a combination of push and pull factors. Now, we said we're going to look at a few key concepts that relate to migration in one way or another. One such key concept is the concept of diaspora. And diaspora is sort of the idea of a population being dispersed around the world, but still keeping a strong connection. Usually, the term was originally used for the dispersion of the Jews, right? So it was like usually when we hear the word diaspora, we think of the Jewish people that were spread all over the world until they got their homeland back in the country of Israel, right? But so the term has been adopted by other groups as well, right? And usually when we talk about diaspora, And this is more in terms of clarification so that you know the term, because you will come across it in the media and in academic papers as well. Usually diasporas are characterized by having a very strong relation to the homeland. So even though people are spread all over the world, they keep a very strong relation to the homeland. They keep a very strong sense of ethnic identity, even though they're abroad. And they also keep very strong relationships with people who are still in their homeland, but also with people from the same group that are all over the world, right? So even though the population is dispersed, there's strong relationships. There's also building of transnational communities. And particularly if we think of the Jews, it's a typical example, right? You have Jewish communities all over the world, and it's usually communities that are very close-knit and that have a very strong connection and that also support each other. They have very strong support systems. Sometimes, or actually quite often, a diaspora will also have a political orientation or a political goal. And as we said, it's usually close-knit communities in the new countries that stay in touch with communities in other countries as well of the same population, of the same group. So this just to keep in mind. Another really, really important concept when it comes to migration is the concept of remittances. Now, remittances are very simply the money that migrants send home to their home countries. Obviously, major transaction companies, Western Union, MoneyGram, there's a lot of others. But remittances, and this is interesting because you might think that this is a small amount of money, but in 2013, remittances globally amounted to 410 billion US dollars, and this is almost 3 times more than the size of global aid budgets. And these stats come from the World Bank, so they should be reliable. So basically what we're saying here is that all the budget that are put together globally, if all the money that goes into foreign aid, which we looked at in last week's session, the remittances are 3 times bigger. So this is massive amounts of money that are sent home, right? And they're also growing very quickly. So there's a yearly growth of about 9% of the remittances that are sent home. And for some countries, remittances are literally the largest source of income. So for example, Tajikistan, 48, so almost half, 48%, almost half of the GMP is remittances. In Lesotho, it's 25% of the country's income that is made up from money that migrants send home to their families, right? So these are massive amounts of money that travel around the world as remittances. Now, obviously, remittances have a lot of advantages, right? Some of them are that they specifically reduce poverty rates because it's a lot of money that comes back into a country. It is money that goes directly to family members in need. So it's not lost along the way. It's not, there's no detour sort of, because it's money that goes straight away to family members that are back home. It's also often money that helps with emergency, that sometimes provides savings for a family, because there is someone abroad sending home money that often, in terms of currency, is also stronger, right? So that can also be an advantage, that the person abroad is actually earning money in a stronger currency, and then that currency is worth more when it's sent home. It's money that is not or almost not susceptible to corruption because it goes straight to family members, and it goes through companies like Western Union, so there is a fee on it, but it goes straight away from person to person. What's also a very big advantage is that it is counter-cyclical, right? So usually if a country is going through a difficult time, through a depression, whatever, usually people abroad will send more remittances, more money back home to compensate for the difficult situation. So, and this is very useful, right? Because usually when a country goes into a recession or into a depression, it is harder to get loans, it is harder to find jobs, so everything becomes more difficult. The only thing that might go up are the remittances that family members from abroad will send home. So it can sort of counter that cyclical, that downfall sort of, which can be really important in order to stabilize families. And what it also does, looking at it on a national level, it increases a nation's foreign reserves as well, right? So these are all advantages. As usual, there's also disadvantages, although in this case, it's not necessarily big ones. One is transaction cost. We already said there is a fee on the transaction of remittances, which is profit that goes straight to the companies that provide the service. So there is a loss there. It also doesn't necessarily translate into economic growth and development, at least not at a country level, right? It can translate into economic growth and development on a family level, because families might be able to build a house, they might be able to invest into a business, or buy property because of remittances. But it doesn't, on a national level, it doesn't necessarily translate into economic growth. Sometimes it can be the case that receiving families can be targeted by gang violence because communities know that this family has family members abroad that are able to send money home. And then also just it can sort of obscure also the exploitation of migrants and the fact that behind migration there's usually separated families, right? Which is the dark side of migration. You might have a migrant that is sending money home, that is working in very exploitative conditions, maybe not even telling his or her family, and the family is back home, right? So there is a separated family behind this, and remittances might sort of obscure that negative part of migration, because remittances are usually the positive side of it, which is that you can send money home to support your people. So this is a really important concept, particularly because of the amount of money that it is globally. It's something that is very much underestimated, but it's one of the major capital flows around the world. Now, another really important concept when we talk migration is the concept of brain drain. It's the systematic loss by a country of its most highly qualified and most skilled people, their talent and their expertise through migration. So this is when a country, usually mostly developing countries, is losing most of its best skilled and qualified people because it can't really offer enough opportunities for them. So the best people leave because they have better opportunities abroad. And this can be very devastating for a country, right? Particularly for a developing country that would need those highly qualified and skilled people the most. When there's a systematic migration of those people, it can be very difficult for a nation state. It can have a very negative impact. So it really is the loss of the best educated and skilled citizens, and it is a great concern for countries. On the other hand, obviously the receiving country, for them it's an advantage, right? Because they might, because of these highly qualified and skilled people that come into the country, it might actually become more competitive on the market, thanks to the migrants, right? And as we said, particularly developing countries and African countries, even more in particular, struggle a lot with brain drain, particularly in certain fields, right? For example, there is a brain drain of doctors, there might be brain drain of IT people, like, so this, you can literally look at this for every sector of jobs or of work. People might be migrating and then leaving the country with a too low level of people, of skilled people in that specific area. Obviously, the rich and powerful countries are the net gainers of this process, and we also call it brain gain, because they're the ones that get the best people, basically, from all over the world, because they can offer better jobs and better salaries. So they're also usually in the position to get the best people from all over the world. An advantage in the longer run of brain drain can be that some migrants do return, and they might return with savings, and they might also return with more knowledge and more expertise. So they might actually be able to come back into their country. Apart from having sent home remittances, they might bring back savings and also be able to start their own businesses, bring in their expertise that they have increased abroad as well. So there can potentially be good sides to it as well, but usually for the country that suffers from brain drain, it can be a massive concern and a massive negative impact. This is one example. This is a chart from the World Health Organization from 2006, so it's a bit older numbers and stats. This is the brain drain of healthcare workers. So the dark orange countries are countries that have a critical shortage of healthcare workers. The lighter ones don't have a shortage, right? So these are countries that on the one hand might not be able to educate and to skill enough doctors and nurses and midwives, but it's also countries that suffer from brain drain. So it's countries where those doctors might be moving abroad, leaving behind a vacuum or a shortage of health workers. So this is just one example, but you can literally find maps like this for pretty much any type of work where there can be a shortage. Now, moving on to sort of the last step of migration, right? We looked at the factors that lead to migration, the push and pull factors. We looked at different types of migrants and ways in which they migrate. We looked at some advantages, disadvantages of migration. Now, integration is the last step, right? Because the arrival in the new country, it's how the integration is also managed by the host country, right? And this is a central aspect of migration as well, because it pretty much determines how well the migration is gonna sort of work out, right? And countries have dealt with integration in very different ways and also with issues that come from integration. Some countries more successfully than others, right? Generally, there's sort of two aspects to it, or two ways of integrating. One is called integration, and then there's one that is called assimilation, which goes much, much further. So when we talk integration, we're usually talking about a process that incorporates individuals from different groups into a society as equals, right? So this involves sort of adding to the existing culture, transforming it. It makes room for a person's sort of individual cultural values, practices, and identities. And it also acknowledges the mutual relationship and impact. So when we talk about integration, usually it's a process that involves both sides, right? It involves the migrants that come into the country, but it also involves the people, the population of the host country, that also kind of makes space or room for foreigners to come in and to adapt to a certain degree, but to also be able to keep some of their own culture, some of their cultural values. So it's sort of you can almost imagine it as a process where both sides sort of open up to each other a bit, and where the host country or the population in the host country is also sort of willing to accept a certain level of diversity because of migration, and where the population in the host country is also willing to sort of integrate people who are different, right? On the other hand, we have the concept of assimilation. This is a process whereby immigrants are sort of required to adopt the ways of the host cultures to fully become part of the host society. So this usually, when a migrant is required to assimilate to the host country, it pretty much implies that this person has to change their values and customs in order to conform to the ones of the host country. And this obviously can imply losing one's identity to a certain level, right? So particularly France has been for many years has been following rather assimilation policies, requesting or sort of requiring immigrants to adapt to a very, very high degree, which can be problematic, right? Because people have their own identities, they have their own values and customs. They not always left their countries because they wanted to. They might be part of the groups of forced migration. And then it's obviously difficult to give up your values just to fit in. And it can also potentially create conflict because people might not be happy in giving up their own cultures. So a lot of countries have sort of been finding some way in between of these two, right? The integration process is a very sort of almost idealistic one that would be what we would want to achieve, but it also requires the host country, the population, to make an effort, which is not always possible, or which maybe the population doesn't always want to make. And so other countries have been using more of an assimilation approach, which can create conflict as well, because the migrants might actually never fully feel integrated or accepted or at home. So every country has been, so you can almost imagine it as a spectrum from integration to assimilation, and each country's migration policy or integration policies are somewhere in between, right? Depending on where they stand politically as well, and also on what parties are in power. Usually right-wing parties will rather push for assimilation because they're not going to want foreign values in their own country. They will rather push for migrants to adapt to a very, very high degree, while usually more left-wing parties will rather advocate for a more integration approach that sort of allows for more cultural diversity and diversity of values in the host country. This is pretty much what I've said already. So, but a bit with a history point of view. In the old days, states usually encouraged immigrants to adopt local culture, right? And as I was saying, France has always made assimilation a requirement for citizenship. But because we're seeing so much migration, and because we also have much more globalization in general and more movement, globalization has forced many states to embrace more multiculturalism, right? So there has sort of been this move towards multiculturalism. On the other hand, we're also seeing that many countries, particularly countries that have a more politically right-wing leadership, are moving away from multiculturalism again and are advocating for stricter border policies as well, stricter integration and immigration policies, right? And one aspect, particularly in Europe, is also that Europe has become more fearful of Islam in general. So there is sort of more of a hesitance when it comes to integrating migrants that come from Islamic countries. And there's several countries in Europe that have specific laws or requirements. France, for example, does not allow children to wear hijabs in schools. Many European countries do not allow burqas. So those are topics that come from the debate around integration, right? Do you allow a woman to wear a burqa, even though it covers her whole body and face, and does not necessarily go with the culture of the host country, or do you not allow it and then force her to give up very fundamental values of her religion and of her life, right? So that's one practical example, and it might seem like sort of a superficial topic, but it comes down to very sort of daily questions of how do we interact in countries when we are becoming more and more diverse. And so every country is handling it differently, every population is, and it's ongoing debates, right? I'm sure you're also aware that many countries have citizenship tests that require the knowledge of language, local history, culture, and geography, right? So particularly if you are staying in the longer term, those tests really require immigrants who want to stay in the country to acquire the knowledge that a local person would have. Now, question for you to think about, and also for us to discuss in the next Q&A, which in this case will be after your semester break. To what extent do you consider immigrants should integrate/assimilate, and how far is too far? And also from another point of view, if you were the immigrant, or maybe you are, to what extent would you personally be willing to assimilate to a host country? And what would be deal breakers? What would be values or customs that you would not be willing to give up in order to fit in a new country? For those of you who enjoy soccer, I'm sure you've seen and heard these quotes on the side. Özil saying, "I'm German when we win, but I'm an immigrant when we lose." Or Benzema saying, "When I score, I'm French. When I don't, I'm Arab." Or when things were going well, I was the Belgian striker. When they weren't, I was the striker of Congolese descent. These are just a few examples, right? But it speaks pretty much to the topic of integration. And to what extent people feel that also the host country is actually accepting them or not, or are they only accepting them in success but not in failure? So this is something to think about and for us to discuss in the next Q&A. Now moving on, I promised you two case studies. The first one is migration to Europe. This is a video that sort of provides sort of an overall explanation of the immigration crisis that Europe has been going through in the past few years.
We don't control where we're born, and wherever that happens to be is where most of us stay. Our families, our friends, our spoken language, everything is there. It's what we know. But this year, hundreds of thousands of people from the countries surrounding the European Union have left the lands of their birth in search of a more peaceful, better life. This is an explanation of the European migration crisis. Europe is used to receiving economically motivated migrants, but they're not used to being overwhelmed by refugees. A refugee is defined as a person who has been forced to leave their country in order to escape war, persecution, or natural disaster. The brutal civil war against a mad dictator in Syria has caused over 4 million people to flee that country. The rise of the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq is causing millions more to leave their countries in search of peace. But refugees are also from Libya, Eritrea, Afghanistan, Nigeria, Sudan, Senegal, and Somalia. The migrants are heading to Europe because they can live there in peace, their economic prospects are far better, and many of them have friends or family that have already made the journey and who hold them there like a magnet. Germany, Europe's 80 million man economic powerhouse, is the top destination. Sweden accepts the most asylum seekers per capita. Some settle in Italy and France. Others would like to continue on to the UK, but as a well-guarded island, the journey is more difficult. Syria's neighbors, Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon, have over 3.5 million Syrians living there, many in sprawling refugee camps just outside their borders. Once outside of Syria, there are several routes people are taking to get to Europe. They cross the Mediterranean into Italy and Greece, and some cross the Black Sea from northern Turkey. Once on the European mainland, the unpassable Alps and more secure borders funnel the migrants through the Balkans to Hungary. From there, buses and trains take them to the German border or other parts of the EU. The situation has reached crisis level now, partially because summertime means the sea and mountains are warm enough to safely cross, and the success stories of refugees now settled in Europe has motivated many more this year than in years past to finally make the push. But that push has also led to 6,000 people drowning in the Mediterranean Sea since the start of 2014, a rate of more than 1% of those who embark on the treacherous journey in unseaworthy boats. These tragedies, images of dead migrants washing ashore, have gripped the world. Refugees are also victimized by degenerate smugglers, like when 71 people perished in Hungary after the driver of a tractor truck left them locked in his trailer. Germany has said it could take up to 1 million asylum seekers this year alone. This isn't just humane, it's wise, considering Germany's low birth rate, aging population, and shortages of available labor. The UK will allow in 20,000 over 5 years, while France will accept 12,000 a year for the next 2 years. Hungary, on the other hand, has built a 4-meter-high fence along its entire 109-mile border with Serbia to force the migrants west into Croatia. The U.S. State Department has said it could accept up to 8,000 Syrian refugees next year, up from the 1,500 total it's brought in so far. The U.S. has provided $4 billion in humanitarian aid. The wealthy Persian Gulf states of Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Bahrain have accepted a grand total of 0 Syrian refugees. The inability of governments to act effectively to solve the crisis has led to some out-of-the-box attempts to help, including an American and his Italian wife, who now patrol the Mediterranean, helping to rescue distressed migrants in the 136-foot ship they spent $8 million on. After the Icelandic government said the country of just over 300,000 could only take in about 50 Syrian refugees, Bryndis Bjorgvinsdottir called out her government to do more and volunteered to house, feed, and clothe a small refugee family. That inspired more than 10,000 other Icelanders to join her on Facebook to offer their homes too. How do you think the refugee crisis should be solved? Is your government doing enough?
This is from 2015, right? So several countries, particularly like Germany, were still quite open to accepting a lot of refugees back then. But they have also had to sort of close their borders more in recent years due to internal pressure from their own populations that didn't necessarily want more migrants. Now, this has obviously had effects, right, in Europe. And this is from 2000, this is a BBC article from 2018, so 3 years later, after sort of the crisis, almost 4 years after the crisis started. And what we're seeing is that across Europe, nationalist and far-right parties have made significant electoral gains, right? And what the article says is that some have taken office, others have become the main opposition voice, and even those yet to gain a political foothold have forced centrist leaders to adapt. In part, this can be seen as a backlash against the political establishment in the wake of the financial and migrant crisis, but the wave of discontent also taps into long-standing fears about globalization and about the dilution of national identity. And if you look at it, this is a map that shows the rise of nationalism in Europe. So these are the amount of votes that the right-wing or nationalist parties got in the different countries. So if you look at it, you have some countries that have very high percentages of voters that vote for the right wing. So for parties that take a stronger stance on limiting immigration, on keeping refugees out and not letting as many numbers of refugees into the country, right? So for example, particularly Germany, the AfD Alternative for Germany, 12.6%. They are also represented in different local governments now. You have Switzerland with the Swiss People's Party that makes almost 29%, although this is going down slightly. You have Austria that also has a very, very strong far-right party. Some of these are nationalist parties, some of them are very, very strong right-wing far-right parties. The Front National in France has a history, and even the League in Italy, they have a history of also sometimes very discriminatory remarks and policies and campaigns. So this is one of the outcomes, or one of the consequences as well, of the increased migration, is that there is a response from the local population as well. Now, what is interesting, because in this migration crisis, if you have been following the news in the past years, you will know that many migrants have died in the Mediterranean Sea because they were not saved by boats, or they simply didn't make the crossing because the boats that they were on were just not safe enough. But what is interesting is that there's actually been legal action, and you can read the whole Guardian article. The link is down here. So the International Criminal Court actually received a submission that calls for the prosecution of some European countries over the death of the migrants. So basically, this is a court case that was started in order to hold member states accountable and to try force them to face punitive actions over all the people that have died in the Mediterranean. So basically, what the court case says is that the EU sort of followed a migration policy that was very much based on deterrence in order to not invite more migrants to follow. And so what the call says is that this allegedly intended to sacrifice the lives of migrants in distress at sea with the sole objective of dissuading others in similar situations from seeking safe haven in Europe. So basically, it accuses some of the biggest European EU member states that have played a very dominant role in the refugee crisis to be complicit in the death of thousands and thousands of refugees in order to sort of keep their borders safe and show strong action against refugees in order to deter more migrants to come, right? So we'll see. As far as I know, there's no result yet. We'll see if there will be punitive action or not. Now, another important case study is the migration to South Africa, right? Not only because we're based here, but also because South Africa is one of the countries that receives a lot of migrants, particularly on the African continent. It's one of the countries that receives the most migration, particularly from all the southern neighboring countries, right? If we look at some stats, these are statistics from Legal Immigration to South Africa. This is from the Migration Policy Institute from 2017. So the most immigrants in 2017 were coming from Zimbabwe, Lesotho, the UK, and then as a fourth, Namibia. On the other hand, legal immigration from South Africa to other countries was first and foremost to the UK, then to Australia, to the US, and to New Zealand. You can see the language pattern here, right? It's all English-speaking countries. And with the UK, there's obviously historical ties as well. So this also kind of reconfirms the different migration factors, right? So this is legal migration, right? Obviously, a big problem in South Africa is also illegal immigration that comes into the country. These are some stats from an article from 2012 from Le Monde Diplomatique that says that only 5% of Africans who migrate actually head for Europe, which one would not expect, right? Looking at the news coverage. And actually 92% of African migrants stay on the continent and travel to another African country. South Africa in 2012 was hosting 83,000 refugees and 400,000 asylum seekers. These numbers have mostly gone up, right? Because migration has increased due to a lot of different reasons. Many migrants travel thousands of kilometers, right? And often across numerous borders. So that's also a thing that we forget, particularly when migrants travel on land, which is what they usually do. They actually cross numerous borders. And according to studies, they spend more than an annual salary on transport and bribes. So there's a massive investment that also goes into a family sending a family member out into another country, right? Which is something that we sometimes forget. Obviously, authorities try to fight illegal migration with detentions, biometrics, deportation. And I'm sure you've seen the news in recent years that detention facilities have been overcrowded, or at least accused of overcrowding, of corruption, of detention of children, and lack of safeguards. So there's a lot going on there. South Africa's border is militarized, you probably know that, but obviously because it's a very long land border, it is very difficult to secure. On average, South Africa spends about 90 million rand each year in deporting immigrants. So it's quite an amount that goes into that. But obviously, a lot of illegal immigration also manages to stay because of corruption in the Department of Home Affairs that makes it possible to obtain false documentation, false permits to stay, false permanent residencies as well, right? So these sort of just some data with regards to illegal immigration to South Africa. There's obviously much more that you can research about. What is interesting is that South African businesses obviously also benefit from migration. On the one hand, from skilled migration, when they specifically want to bring people in that might have special skills and that then have to go through a very difficult immigration process. On the other hand, also because illegal migrants might be easier workforce, right? That works at lower wages. So in both senses, in terms of illegal immigration, but also in terms of legal and high-skilled migration, businesses usually rather benefit from migration, which speaks again to how businesses generally prefer a freedom of flows, right? Flows of people, flows of money, because it actually benefits their businesses, while usually the nation states rather prefers to be in control of the flows of people that come in and out of a country, right? So it's just an example as well for that conflict between businesses and the nation state or government. Now, I'm pretty sure you remember last year's xenophobic attacks that happened in Johannesburg. Here are two quick videos or short documentaries on it. One is from France 24 and the other one from Al Jazeera. I'll just show you both of them. And then we have some debriefing questions that we can also discuss in the next Q&A session.
A South African police officer fires rubber bullets on Tuesday to disperse protesters in the township of Alexandra in Johannesburg. The district has been rocked by 2 nights of xenophobic violence, and it has spread to neighbouring townships. Several people have been killed. Shops belonging to foreigners were burnt and looted. Such attacks have been frequent in recent years in a country where the unemployment rate is nearly 28%.
So like that, 6 months, 3 months is gone, again it's broken. Government no action, so how to standing there? Who give it life? Just last night, police. I call police. Police says open my gate. I coming out. If you know police not coming, is a meaning is dead. Me and my uncle.
Local representatives visited Alexandra and condemned the violence.
There's a xenophobic sentiment underlying this about foreigners having to leave. We are a democracy. We are a democratic society. We can't allow people to take the law into their own hands. There is no country that doesn't have foreign nationals.
President Cyril Ramaphosa, in a video posted on Twitter, said xenophobic violence was unacceptable. His Nigerian counterpart Muhammadu Buhari expressed deep concern over attacks against Nigerians in South Africa. He has dispatched a special envoy to the country. Immigration from across the continent and Southeast Asia increased in the early 1990s. After the end of apartheid rule and the initial economic boom that followed. The worst wave of xenophobic violence was in 2008, when more than 60 people were reportedly killed.
And here also a report by Al Jazeera of the same conflict of 2019.
Police in South Africa try again to stop rioting and looting in some poor neighborhoods in and around Johannesburg. It's been like this since Sunday. Some of the businesses and shops vandalized belong to foreign nationals. This is not the first time Mohammed Abdul Hussein has been through this. He says his other store in another part of the city was looted last year.
If it's every year something like this, how can I do? I can make something for my families, for my children, for my parents is there. Because we come from so far from the work. Not for a crime or whatever. Only for work.
Some South Africans believe criminal gangs are responsible for the violence. Mario Abrunosa says he got a phone call early in the morning that his business was being looted, but it was too dangerous for him to move. Now that it's relatively quiet, he's come back to assess the damage.
I still found people still looting as I arrived here with the police presence. And all I wanted to say is it's not about foreign in the shop. I'm a South African citizen. I employ some South African people that work for me in the shop. And they targeted, it's just a pure criminality attack that they've done here to me. And I'm running at a loss. I'm without words. I don't know what else to say.
Some say the country's high unemployment rate, now nearly at 30%, widespread poverty and inequality are to blame for the violence. In 2008, at least 60 people were killed and more than 50,000 forced from their homes when mainly foreign African nationals were targeted. 4 years ago, at least 7 people were killed. Some South Africans feel they are competing with outsiders for scarce jobs. Human rights groups say anti-immigrant comments made by some politicians are making things worse.
There's a xenophobic sentiment underlying this about foreigners having to leave. We are a democracy. We are a democratic society. We can't allow people to take the law into their own hands. There is no country that doesn't have foreign nationals.
President Cyril Ramaphosa has condemned the attacks as xenophobic and unacceptable. More than 100 people have been arrested for public violence, arson and looting. But in some areas, the police seem overwhelmed, making it easy for some people to stay in the street. Harun Matasa, Al Jazeera, Johannesburg.
Now, questions for you to think ahead already, and then we'll also discuss in your groups. How do you feel about immigrants and about immigration to South Africa? How do you feel about xenophobic attacks? What do you think can and should be done by the South African government? What do you think can and should be done by the South African people? And lastly, what does a good integration look like for you? What would you argue would be a good integration from both sides, right? From side of the immigrants, but also from side of the host country or the population in the host country. These are just some questions to think about. As I said, we will discuss them in the next Q&A. Now, I mentioned in the beginning that we're going to close by looking at the good sides of migration. Generally, migration is rather portrayed as something negative. That's sort of the news that we get about it. We obviously get reading the news about the migration stories that go wrong. We don't hear about the migrant that started a successful business. So it's important to also look at the good sides of migration, right? So we'll start by looking at the benefits for the home nation, right? So the country where people are leaving. Obviously, a very big advantage of migration for the home country are the remittances that are sent back home and that provide direct capital. Another positive factor can be that returning migrants might bring back savings, they might come back better skilled, and they might be able to actually bring all of that back into their home countries. Another potential benefit is that the workers that are left actually face less competition, right? So this can sort of be an advantage of brain drain because your best people leave. The people that are left behind actually face less unemployment, face less competition amongst each other, right? So that can, on an individual level, be an advantage as well. And it is also said, and there's studies around this as well, that brain drain actually creates pressure for greater democratization. So because countries and governments are afraid of brain drain, because it can be so devastating for their country, the sort of the fear of brain drain can actually push them to be more democratic, to do a better job in providing employment for people. So it can sort of be a motivating factor for governments to actually do better in their own countries. On the other hand, for the receiving nations, obviously the receiving nation has the benefit of brain gain, so the gain of mostly young and flexible workers of all types. Often migrants also do work that natives rather avoid or wouldn't do, so there's also migrants filling in certain professions. Migrants might also free up natives to take on other jobs. Like we see that there's a lot of migrants who do daycare jobs, who look after the elderly, and by doing so are freeing family members to work in other jobs, which can also be good for the people involved, but also for the economy. And something that we forget, but that is a very big aspect, migrants are also consumers and they're also taxpayers, particularly if it's legal migrants, which is the majority, right? So they also contribute to the economy of the receiving nations by simply consuming and by paying taxes. And lastly, the increased diversity can also be a benefit, right? Because it can actually also create a more interesting, more diverse society that can learn from each other, right? Now, these are some of the good sides of migration, mostly sort of the more economic aspects. And to close today's session, I have one last short video that also sort of highlights the good sides of migration and challenges some of the stereotypes that we have about migration.
We hear about immigration endlessly, people debating why it's good, why it's bad, but what's really the case? Are immigrants criminals, stealing jobs and sponging welfare benefits? Well, let's just look at the research. First, immigrants don't commit more crime than natives. Take Germany. Even with its mass influx of migrants in 2015, its own Federal Office of Criminal Investigation said migrants had not increased the crime rate. And police noted that the typical native German was actually more likely to engage in crime. And it's the same in the country with the largest number of immigrants in the world, the US. The American Immigration Council says innumerable studies have confirmed immigrants are less likely to commit serious crimes or be behind bars than the native born. Second, when it comes to jobs and wages for natives, the vast majority of research shows that immigrants actually have a positive effect. And take this one significant study that saw immigrants in the US can lower the wages for high school dropouts and college graduates. Well, after averaging all wage changes, it actually saw a tiny overall wage increase. And the author of that report even wrote in 2016, the influx of immigrants can potentially increase the total wealth of the population. And do natives even want the jobs that many immigrants have? One U.S. experiment took 6,500 farm jobs that Mexican migrants usually did and offered them exclusively to unemployed Americans. But only 268 people applied, more than half quit a month later, and less than 3% of Americans actually finished the job, while 90% of Mexicans did. And finally, the argument that immigrants unfairly take benefits, well, the OECD found that in most countries, except in those with a large share of older migrants, they contribute more in taxes and social contributions than they receive in individual benefits. And immigrants are also more than twice as likely as natives to start a business, bringing substantial benefits to advanced economies. Think about it. Google, AT&T, Yahoo, SpaceX, WhatsApp, etc., were all founded by immigrants. Now, if you want to debate integration and cultural differences, fine. But if we're talking about crime and economy, well, the research has spoken. And overall, immigration is a good thing.
This was produced by Al Jazeera in 2017. Also a good conversation starter for the next Q&A session. Maybe for you to already start thinking, 3 questions. Considering that the many common beliefs about immigrants and about migration are not actually proven with statistics, why do you think is immigration so contested nowadays? What do you think are the main fears of people regarding immigration? And how do you think should nation states and should the global community deal with migration more ideally? These just 3 questions for you. Please take some notes, please prepare for it so that you have something ready for the conversation in our online class. That's it for today's session. Next week, semester break. Enjoy, have fun, take some time off to relax and to just do something else than studying. And then we'll see each other again the week after on Wednesday on the 30th September for the Q&A session on this lecture. And after that, we'll have the online lecture 7 on health, disease, and contagion. Obviously, a very current topic, right? I think we've all experienced globalization and health this year. So we'll just look at the more theoretical aspects of it. That's it for today. Thank you for your attention and have a good afternoon or evening.